Our next speaker is Professor Gong Peng, who is a professor of environmental science at the University of California, Berkeley, originally from China. And he's going to be addressing the issue of the problems of planetary health in China and what the Chinese are attempting to do about it.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here, like what Professor Andy Hinch has said. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about environmental change as determined from remotely sensed data. First, I'd like to start just by showing the world population projection by United Nations. There's a saying that expectation that in this century that the world population will not stabilize. But part of the regions such as Asia, as you can see on the right figure, that it is peaking to maybe in the middle of the century. And Africa is actually gaining up the momentum. It's increasing. So we need to keep in mind the world population are developing differently in different regions. I'll come back to that. Good news is that China will peak around 2030. And by then, it will decline. In my generation, for example, one family will have 5, 6, 7 kids. And now, because of the family planning is taking effect, that most of the families having 1 kid or 2. So the consequence is that the world is going to be aging. We are facing with an aging population. If we look at China, like many parts of the world, land resources is restricted. I have 2 figures here. Roughly 20% of the land in China is supporting approximately 80% of the population. So that's a basic background. So the more than 1.3 billion people is living in this situation. And also in the past 20, 30 years, China's population migration has been changing greatly. So on an every 5-year basis, that it's been doubling. So we're talking about now annually more than 200 million people migrating from rural to the cities, from the west to the east. So that has a lot of implications to health. So what I want to quickly show you is China's environmental change determined from remote sensing, mostly done by my group. The first is the urbanization. If you look at North China Plain, lots of people fly on that plain would see that the villages are getting connected. So huge flat land are being occupied by settlement. But if you look at the county statistics or census data, that the figures are relatively small. So I'm highlighting in there, on the left is what has been determined by satellite imagery. On the right is a census by the county bureau, statistical bureau. You can see there's basically a doubling effect, in basically for every county, there's an underestimation by the census data. So that's a kind of, so basically census data cannot be trusted. So if we look at the speed of urbanization for 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, for every city determined by remotely sensed data, you will find 2.5 times more urbanization, urbanized land has been added to the 1990 landscape. So that's quite substantial. And no wonder some researchers and scholars are saying that roughly 50% of the steel and concrete production are being consumed in China for the past 20 years. And that trend is going to continue for a while. So is China overall, the environment, is China becoming greener? Is the government and the people, they're trying to improve the environment there? If you look at the figure here for the past 13 years or so, it is. In general, China is becoming greener thanks to the afforestation efforts. But in some of the regional areas, such as northeast of China and also in the Yangtze River Delta region, due to development, the environment actually is not becoming greener. It's actually becoming, less forestation or other green spaces are happening there. So you could also look at the water dynamics in China or the wetland. So this particular figure shows we did some analysis about a 30-year wetland change in China. And we can see the best natural wetland, which is the inland marshland in China, 1/3 of it has gone. So that's not a good news for the environment. The Chinese government is doing something for it. Similarly, on lake, using remote sensing, you can determine the dynamics of the lakes. The water comes and goes in some of the open lake systems in China. And we could also study the air quality. For example, using NOx as one indicator, you could estimate, you could see the change in 3 different periods. In the 1990s, in the northern China plain, the air quality isn't that bad. But you look at the red color that has been increasing since then. And now they're joining into regions. So it's not just spotty locations, but regions are becoming red. So that means the NOx concentration is increasing. Using Los Angeles as a benchmark, we can see from the 1990s and early 2000s compared to roughly around 2010, even the small cities are exceeding the NOx concentration than Los Angeles. So that's why a lot of the world need to learn from developed regions like Los Angeles or other cities. So what I want to continue to say is that mapping a region is not enough. We must monitor the entire planet. So I'm showing an example that this is a global land cover mapping made in our group, the finest resolution in the world that has been produced using most primarily American Landsat data, satellite data. If you look at the world studying land cover, that the hotspot areas are indicating those regions are more frequently researched. But if you compare that with the world biodiversity hotspot regions, you will see that land cover maps, which constitute one part of the conservation areas in terms of habitat, provide habitat information for it, that they do not match with each other. So that shows there's a disciplinary barrier between different group of people working on Mother Nature, Earth. So we need to work together from different disciplines. What I'm trying to continue to say is monitoring the world is not enough. We need to understand the major processes and model the world. This gives you an example that we are working on modeling the crop yields of the world. And in 2012, there is a Midwest drought. And we are using climate data and all sorts of available data using yield model to estimate the impact of drought to the corn yield in United States, in Midwest. We need to do more. So we need to build an entire Earth system model that includes major processes of the world. And the red part is the disease transmission need to be integrated into the Earth system model so that we could help the policymakers and decision makers on projecting into the future. So we must adopt a new research paradigm that is being laid out in the Planetary Health Commission report, just we're here for. So some of the highlights I learned from the transdisciplinary planetary health collaborative study is research need to be, we need to have change, globalization, people, and population dynamics in our mind. Anything local needs to be put under a global context for our research. Yes, there are challenges. One of them is we're not certain about the impact of the joint interactions of multiple environmental challenges on human health. We need to do more research on that. Another one is understanding the planetary health needs better data and quantitative tools. And the strongest computing power. If you think about climate modeling requires, the world's fastest computers, the whole Earth system model requires more computing power to do that. And provide planning and decision support tools to developing countries and to avoid mistakes made in developed countries. So think about Africa in this century. Population is growing. What can we do to prevent them from repeating the mistakes that has been made elsewhere? That's the kind of message I like to deliver. Thank you.